Rain fell in thick, unrelenting sheets against Vance Manor's window panes, blurring the muted landscape into gray. She stood there, a solitary figure, her delicate fingers tracing the cold glass. Each raindrop seemed an insistent reminder of her precarious world. The chill seeped into her bones, mirroring the dread rooted deep within her. She thought of Duke Alaric Thorne, a man whose very name carried the weight of obligation, of a future not her own. His image, sharp and unyielding in her mind, offered no comfort at all. The manor itself seemed to sigh with the weather, an old house slowly succumbing to neglect. Faded tapestries depicted hunting scenes, their colors muted by decades of dust and sun. A faint scent of damp earth and decaying wood lingered, a constant companion. Eleanor knew every creak of the floorboards, every draft from the ill-fitting windows. Each sound whispered stories of a grandeur long past. Her gaze drifted over the overgrown rose garden, a wilderness now. It had once bloomed with spectacular beauty. The thorny bushes clawed at the wet air, a struggle she understood intimately. A soft, rattling cough echoed from the sitting room nearby. It pulled her from reverie. It was her father, Baron Frederick Vance. The sound pierced her heart with its fragility. The cough was a constant drumbeat in their quiet home, a physical sign of their family's decline. She knew he sat by the cold hearth, a thin blanket draped over his shoulders, lost in sorrow. His health had withered alongside their fortune, leaving him a shadow of the proud man he once was. He carried the weight of their ruin heavily, a burden Eleanor felt pressing down on her shoulders as well. She imagined the Duke, a man of immense power, accustomed to meticulous order and pristine surroundings. What would he think of Vance Manor, this decaying monument to a noble name? The thought brought a flush of shame to her cheeks. She was trading her freedom, her very self, to save this crumbling legacy. Her mother's lessons on honor, whispered in happier times, now felt like a heavy crown, beautiful yet impossibly burdensome. She walked into the sitting room, the carpet threadbare beneath her worn slippers, making no sound. Baron Frederick looked up, his eyes, once full of sparkling ambition, now held deep, weary sadness. "Eleanor, my dear," he croaked, his voice thin, almost translucent. "Still by the window dreaming?" "Only watching the rain, Papa," she replied, her voice soft, trying to inject a lightness she did not feel. She sat on a worn armchair opposite him, its horsehair stuffing long since flattened. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was heavy, filled with unspoken anxieties and the echoes of their shared misfortune. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, lines carved by worry and regret. He looked at her, his only child. She knew he saw his last hope. The Vance family name, once revered in high circles, was now a whisper of pity. Debts accumulated like dust motes dancing in meager light. Land, once expansive, sold off parcel by parcel, left them little more than this crumbling manor and the ghosts of their ancestors. Eleanor remembered happier days, lively balls, the rustle of silk gowns, the laughter that once filled these rooms. Now silence reigned, broken only by the rain, her father's cough and the gnawing of despair. She felt her father's pressure of expectation, a silent plea in his every glance. Her impending marriage to Duke Alaric Thorne was no love match. It was a transaction, a desperate alliance forged in necessity's cold fire. The Duke held a formidable reputation, respected and feared. He was known for shrewd intellect and impenetrable reserve. He owned vast estates, controlled industries, held sway in high society's echelons. Their union would restore the Vance name and secure her father's precarious financial standing. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. She heard stories of the Duke, whispered behind cupped hands at the few social gatherings she still attended. He was said to be ruthless in business, unwavering in decisions, and utterly without sentiment. He was a force, an enigma. Soon he would be her husband. Her heart fluttered with a nervous energy, not excitement, but profound apprehension. She imagined his piercing blue eyes, cold, assessing, devoid of the warmth she secretly longed for. His touch, she imagined, would be formal and distant, never truly connecting. A sharp, unwelcome memory surfaced. Her mother, elegant and composed, spoke of marriage as duty, a joining of families, not merely hearts. Eleanor had been young then, full of romantic notions from the poetry she devoured. Now she understood the stark reality. Duty had become her master, stripping away all vestiges of personal desire. She would walk down the aisle, a sacrifice upon the altar of family honor. The thought made her stomach clench with a dull ache. Could she live a life without warmth, without love, bound to a man who saw her as little more than an advantageous alliance? The afternoon wore on, a slow, methodical march towards an uncertain future. The silence in the sitting room deepened, broken only by the old grandfather clocks ticking in the hall. Eleanor picked at a loose thread on her simple gown, mended many times. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious silk she once wore. Each stitch was a story of dwindling resources, a testament to her family's desperate plight. She thought of the dowry, a pitiful sum, almost an insult to the Duke's standing. Her name, her lineage, however tarnished, held the fragile promise of value. Suddenly, a brisk knock echoed through the quiet house. It was unexpected, startling both Eleanor and her father. A maid, Martha, whose loyalty remained steadfast despite the lack of wages, appeared at the sitting room door, her face slightly flushed. She held a heavy sealed envelope, its parchment creamy white, bearing an imposing crest. "A rider just delivered this, my lady," Martha announced, her voice hushed. "From Thorn Castle." Eleanor felt a jolt, a sudden tightening in her chest. This was it. The inevitable had arrived. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the letter. The wax seal, intricately embossed with the thorn sigil, felt cold and solid beneath her thumb. She broke it with a slow, deliberate movement. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Her father watched her, his own breath held captive in his lungs. The elegant script spoke of formality and precision. It was from the Duke's steward, addressed to Baron Frederick Vance. It stated in clear terms that Duke Alaric Thorn would arrive at Vance Manor next Tuesday morning to finalize the engagement terms. The words were polite, almost clinical, utterly devoid of personal sentiment. No mention of anticipation, no hint of welcome, just the cold facts of an impending business arrangement. Eleanor read the letter twice, her eyes scanning each word, seeking any crumb of humanity, any flicker of warmth. She found none. It was exactly as she expected, yet it still felt like a punch to the gut. The Duke was coming. The abstract dread was now a tangible, imminent reality. Her future, once a nebulous fear, now had a date and time stamped upon it. She slowly folded the letter, her fingers pressing the crisp paper. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, heavy with unspoken expectations. She looked at her father, whose anxious gaze fixed on her face, searching for a sign. She forced a small, tremulous smile, a performance for his sake. "He will arrive next Tuesday, Papa," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. To finalize the terms. A sigh of relief escaped her father's lips, a profound sound speaking volumes of the burden he carried. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if a great weight had been lifted. "Thank heaven," he murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank heaven for his grace's generosity." Generosity. The word felt like an insult, a bitter taste on her tongue. Was she to be grateful for this forced union? This cold bargain? Was her entire life defined by the Duke's convenient agreement to take her as his wife, rescuing her family from complete ruin? A wave of humiliation washed over her, hot and stinging. Her pride, a stubborn flame still flickering despite their destitution, recoiled from the thought. She was not a charity case. She was Lady Eleanor Vance. She rose from the chair, a sudden need for solitude overwhelming her. Her father's relief, though understandable, only amplified her despair. She walked slowly, deliberately, back to her small, sparsely furnished bedroom. The window offered a view of the weeping sky, but she did not look out. Instead, her hand instinctively went to her neck, fingers closing around the cool, smooth metal of the Vance family locket. It was an antique silver locket, intricately engraved with the Vance crest, a lion rampant. Inside, carefully preserved, were miniature portraits of her parents in their youth. Their faces were bright with hope and love. Her mother vibrant and smiling, her father strong and full of life. It was a tangible link to a past that felt impossibly distant, a reminder of the love that once filled these walls. Hot, sudden tears welled in her emerald eyes, blurring the faint images within the locket. She blinked them back fiercely, determined not to succumb. But one escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, a single glistening testament to her pain. She swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in her throat. Her family, her name, her honor. These were the stakes. This locket, containing her family's history, felt like the very heart of her burden. She pressed it against her chest, feeling its solid presence, and closed her eyes. A silent prayer, barely a whisper, escaped her lips. It was a desperate plea for strength, for guidance, for a future beyond cold obligation. Dread coiled in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of fragile hope flickered. She waited for Tuesday. The rain had ceased, leaving the world outside her window damp and gray. Eleanor clasped the Vance family locket, anticipating the Duke's arrival with dread and fragile hope. The first sign was a tremor through the ancient floorboards. A distant thrumming grew louder, a deep rumble against the quiet countryside. Eleanor stood by the parlor window, her breath catching. A sleek, black carriage emerged from the lane, moving with quiet speed. It stood out against the worn gray stone of her home. The coachman, in dark livery, sat ramrod straight. The carriage halted with a sigh of springs before the entrance. Its gleaming panels reflected the dull sky, contrasting with the manor's faded grandeur. Eleanor's eyes traced the intricate silver crest. The Thorne family symbol, powerful and unyielding. A tightening in her chest marked the chasm separating her world from his. This was no ordinary visitor. This was the Duke, and his presence felt like a judgment. An impeccable footman descended, opening the door. Eleanor watched, her fingers tightening around the cool silver of her locket. A dark, imposing figure emerged, tall and unyielding, a silhouette against the muted light. Duke Alaric Thorne. The name felt heavy, a burden for months. He paused, surveying the rain-soaked grounds with detached appraisal. His gaze swept the overgrown rose bushes, the cracked path, and peeling paint, missing nothing of the manor's decay. Eleanor felt a blush of shame creep up her neck. Her family's struggles, laid bare for this wealthy man, were humiliating. She straightened her simple mended gown, a futile gesture against his undeniable wealth. Her reflection in the window showed a young woman with tired, pale features, her emerald eyes wide with apprehension. This was the woman he came to claim, or perhaps to dismiss. The Duke turned toward the manor, his steps measured as he ascended to the heavy oak door. Eleanor heard the distant, firm knock. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Old Martha, her face etched with worry, would answer. Eleanor took a shuddering breath, trying to summon the Vance dignity she had been taught to uphold, even in ruin. She moved from the window, light and hesitant, towards the parlor door. Her father, Baron Frederick Vance, waited by the hearth. His slender frame seemed to shrink within his threadbare velvet dressing gown. He looked older, frail, his kind eyes clouded with anxiety. He offered Eleanor a weak, encouraging smile, a brave attempt, but his hands trembled slightly on the antique chair. The parlor, tidied by Martha, could not disguise its age. Once vibrant tapestries were faded, their patterns muted. A faint scent of damp wood and old parchment filled the air, a melancholic perfume. Eleanor smoothed her skirt, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. This meeting felt less like a prelude to marriage, more like a final judgment. The heavy parlor door creaked open. Martha announced, her voice barely a whisper, "Duke Alaric Thorne, my lady, my lord." Alaric stepped into the room and the air grew colder, sharper. He was taller than Eleanor imagined. His presence commanding, intimidating. His dark, impeccably tailored coat absorbed the faint light, making him formidable. His features were sharp, aristocratic, a chiseled profile speaking of power. His piercing blue eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. They paused on Eleanor for a fraction of a second, a fleeting, almost accidental glance, before settling on her father. "Baron Vance," Alaric's voice was deep, resonant, devoid of warmth. It carried an authority that resonated through the quiet room. He offered a curt, formal bow, a gesture of respect to the title, not the man. "Your Grace," Frederick replied, his voice shaky, as he managed a deeper bow that clearly cost him. "Welcome to Vance Manor." Alaric barely acknowledged the welcome. His gaze fixed on Frederick, his expression unreadable, a mask of polite indifference. He did not extend a hand to Eleanor, nor offer pleasantries. It was as if she were not truly present, a silent fixture, an object to be observed. Her hand, instinctively rising, fell back to her side, a pang of hurt blossoming in her chest. This man, her intended husband, treated her with less regard than furniture. Eleanor felt a slow, creeping chill, unrelated to the damp air. His coldness was a deliberate choice, a calculated distance. She studied him then, her emerald eyes, usually soft, now sharpened. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His strong, long-fingered hands rested at his sides, devoid of fidgeting. He exuded complete control, a master of emotions, or perhaps a man with none. "I trust your journey was satisfactory, Your Grace?" Frederick asked, trying to inject warmth into the stilted conversation. "Adequate," Alaric replied, his tone clipped. He moved further into the room but did not sit, maintaining an implicitly superior posture. "I am here to discuss the terms of the arrangement, Baron. I believe you understand the urgency." His words, though directed at Frederick, felt like a direct blow to Eleanor. The arrangement. Not a marriage but a transaction. It reduced her to a commodity. The fragile hope for human connection beneath his exterior flickered and died. She felt her face tighten, forming a mask to hide the sting of his dismissiveness. Frederick cleared his throat. "Indeed, Your Grace. Please do sit. Eleanor, my dear, perhaps you would offer the Duke some refreshment." Eleanor's gaze flew to her father, a silent plea in her eyes. He tried to include her, to force normalcy, but it felt terribly out of place. She felt burning humiliation. Alaric, however, cut across her father's suggestion with a dismissive wave. "Unnecessary, Baron. My time is rather limited." His blue eyes, cold and assessing, rested on Eleanor for a moment. It was not recognition or curiosity, but evaluation, cataloging her features, assigning a value. A look that stripped her of personhood. She felt a prickling behind her eyes, a precursor to tears, but blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of him. "Very well, Your Grace." Frederick sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Then perhaps we can proceed directly." He gestured to two chairs, pulling one out for Alaric. Alaric finally sat, his movements economical, precise. He crossed one leg over the other, his posture radiating untouchable arrogance. He did not invite Frederick to sit first. He merely waited, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the Baron, an expectant, almost impatient glint. Eleanor remained standing, feeling extraneous, a silent observer at her own execution. She folded her hands tightly, the cool locket pressing into her palm. She listened as Alaric spoke in a low monotone, discussing legalities and financial clauses. He spoke of dowries and settlements, of family honor and obligations, but his words were devoid of human emotion. He spoke as if reading a dry legal document, his gaze never straying to Eleanor. Her father, weakened, tried to hold his own in the discussion, navigating complex terms with his remaining strength. Eleanor watched worry lines deepen on his face, his hands occasionally clenching beneath the table. He fought for their survival, for her future, yet Alaric offered no quarter. The Duke's responses were concise, firm, leaving no room for negotiation or sentiment. Eleanor felt a growing knot of despair. This man did not care. He did not care about her father's failing health, their precarious manner, or her quiet dignity. He saw only numbers, contracts, a problem to be solved with no fuss. Her heart ached with loneliness, a chilling realization that her life was reduced to a mere transaction. She remembered her mother's stories, whispered late at night by the fire, of love matches, grand gestures, knights, ladies, hearts intertwined. Her mother, whose miniature portrait lay within the locket, believed in love conquering all. But this world, unfolding now, was cold, calculating, devoid of romance. It was a world of power and pragmatism, where a young woman's worth was property and standing, not spirit or heart. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Alaric's expensive cologne, a sharp, clean aroma, filled the room, overpowering the manor's faint scent. It was another tangible sign of his intrusive dominance. Eleanor found herself clenching her jaw, a dull ache beginning behind her temples. She wanted this visit over, to escape the suffocating weight of his indifference. Finally, Alaric rose, his movements fluid and precise. "I believe that covers the essential points, Baron Vance." He looked at his ornate pocket watch, a flash of gold. "My steward will be in contact to finalize the specifics." Frederick, looking utterly drained, also stood, with considerably more effort. "Thank you, Your Grace, for your time." Alaric gave another curt nod, his piercing blue eyes sweeping over Eleanor again, this time with a hint of impatience. He moved towards the door, not waiting for Frederick to escort him. His task was complete. As he reached the doorway, he paused. For the briefest moment, his eyes met Eleanor's. There was no flicker of warmth, no hint of understanding, only a cold, distant assessment. It was the look one gives a landscape or a piece of art, beautiful but impersonal. Eleanor felt a shiver trace her spine. He saw nothing in her. Absolutely nothing. He turned, leaving the parlor with the same deliberate, silent grace. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving Eleanor and her father in oppressive silence. Frederick sank back into his chair, a weary sigh escaping his lips. "He is very direct," Frederick murmured, running a hand through his thinning hair. "A man of business, through and through." Eleanor did not respond. Her throat felt tight, constricted. She moved slowly back towards the window, her gaze fixed on the front door, waiting for the carriage. She watched as Alaric emerged, followed by his footman. He exchanged words with the coachman, then spoke to another man waiting nearby. This must be his steward, a man of precise movements and quiet efficiency, much like the Duke. The steward bowed his head slightly as Alaric spoke, his voice low but clear enough that a few words drifted through the parlor's open window, carried on a sudden gust of wind. "Expedite this arrangement, Jenkins," Alaric commanded, his voice devoid of inflection. "I want this matter concluded swiftly." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Expedite this arrangement. The phrase echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. It was not a marriage he sought, not even a reluctant union. It was a problem, an inconvenience, something to be cleared from his schedule quickly. The word expedite spoke volumes, reducing her future, her very existence, to a bureaucratic task. A wave of profound dread washed over her, a terrible certainty settling deep within her heart. This man felt nothing, desired nothing from her save a quick, clean resolution. She watched the black carriage pull away, disappearing down the lane, leaving only the cold, damp air, and a terrifying sense of her own insignificance. A chill, more profound than any she had known, settled deep within her soul. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel path leading to Thorn Castle, each revolution a stark reminder of the distance separating Eleanor's world from the Duke's. Days had passed since Alaric's brief, dismissive visit to Vance Manor. The summons had arrived just that morning, a crisp, formal note bearing the Duke's imposing seal, requesting her immediate presence at Thorn Castle for a private discussion. Eleanor had dressed in her best, albeit faded, emerald gown, hoping to project a dignity she felt slipping away with each passing hour. A faint tremor ran through her fingers as she clutched the worn leather strap inside the carriage. Her stomach tightened into a knot. What could he possibly want now? She had expected a meeting to discuss the wedding arrangements, perhaps the formal announcement. The chill that had traced her spine after overhearing Alaric's steward now felt like a tightening band around her chest. Thorn Castle loomed against the pale sky, a formidable presence of gray stone and towering turrets. It was not a home, Eleanor realized, but a fortress, a monument to power and ancient lineage. The carriage rolled through an immense archway, echoing her arrival through the silent courtyard. Servants dressed in pristine liveries moved with quiet efficiency, their faces impassive as they opened the carriage door. The air itself felt different here, colder, heavier, filled with the scent of aged stone and polished wood. Eleanor stepped out, her slender frame feeling utterly insignificant beneath the vastness of the castle walls. She straightened her shoulders, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming grandeur. A stern-faced butler, his expression as unyielding as the castle itself, led her through labyrinthine corridors. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting ancient battles and stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every step. Each grand room they passed, each gleaming suit of armor, served to underscore the immense chasm between her family's decaying manor and the Duke's undeniable wealth. Her own worn slippers seemed to scuff too loudly on the polished marble floors. She could feel the faint chill permeating the stone, a coldness that seemed to seep into her very bones. Finally, they arrived at a vast drawing room. The butler announced her name with a deep, resonant voice that seemed to swallow the air. Duke Alaric Thorne stood by an enormous fireplace, its mantelpiece adorned with elaborate carvings. He did not turn immediately, instead gazing into the dying embers, his back to her. The room was breathtaking in its opulence, yet it felt utterly devoid of warmth. Rich velvet drapes, the color of claret wine, hung from impossibly high windows. A crystal chandelier, glittering like frozen tears, dominated the ceiling. Yet, despite the lavish display, there was a stark, almost clinical order to everything, an impersonal perfection that left Eleanor feeling exposed and vulnerable. Alaric finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, emphasizing his broad shoulders and commanding presence. His piercing blue eyes, like shards of ice, swept over her, a brief, assessing glance that held no warmth, no recognition of her as a person. He offered no greeting, no gesture of welcome. His face remained impassive, betraying nothing of his thoughts. He simply looked at her, his silence more unnerving than any sharp word. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She gripped her hands tightly in front of her, trying to still their slight tremble. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice deep and resonant, yet devoid of any inflection that might suggest personal interest. It was the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, not engaging in polite conversation. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He gestured vaguely towards a large, polished mahogany table in the center of the room. On it lay a single crisp parchment, neatly folded. "Please be seated." Eleanor moved towards the table, her steps feeling oddly heavy. She settled into one of the ornate, high-backed chairs, its velvet cold against her skin. Alaric took the opposite seat, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her shrink slightly under his scrutiny. He picked up the document, his long fingers carefully unfolding it. The faint rustle of the parchment was the only sound in the vast room. He pushed it across the table toward her. "I have had my solicitors prepare this for you," Alaric stated, his voice flat, emotionless. He watched her, waiting for her reaction. His blue eyes seemed to bore into her, leaving her no place to hide. Eleanor looked at the document, then back at him, a flicker of confusion in her emerald eyes. She saw the heavy seals, the elegant script, the formal language of legal proceedings. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. "What is this, Your Grace?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper, betraying the sudden fear that gnawed at her. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers tracing the edge of the parchment without touching the words. Alaric leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanging. "It is an offer, Lady Eleanor. A fair and generous one, I believe, considering the circumstances." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "It is a financial settlement for you and your family, a substantial sum designed to alleviate your current difficulties and ensure your future comfort." Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her. A financial settlement? Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the meaning behind his cold, precise words. She stared at the document, the ornate letters blurring before her eyes. He was not discussing wedding plans. He was not talking about their future together. He was talking about money. "I fail to understand, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Her pride, a fragile shield, began to crack. "Allow me to clarify," Alaric continued, his tone patient, as if explaining a complex business transaction to a slow-witted clerk. "This engagement, as you know, was arranged for pragmatic reasons, to unite our families, to provide a solution to your family's financial predicament." He paused, a flicker of something, perhaps impatience in his eyes. "However, I have come to believe it is an unsuitable match for both of us." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Unsuitable match. He spoke of her as if she were a faulty ledger entry, an inconvenient calculation. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck, hot and mortifying. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. Her delicate features tightened. "This settlement," Alaric pressed on, seemingly oblivious to her rising distress, would provide your family with enough capital to clear their debts, restore Vance Manor, and establish a comfortable allowance for you. It would free you from the necessity of marrying for financial security. He gestured to the document with a dismissive flick of his wrist. And of course, it would free me from an arrangement that, while perhaps politically expedient, offers little else. He spoke as if he were discussing a trade deal, a land acquisition, anything but her life, her future, her very person. The casual indifference in his voice was a physical blow. He saw her not as a woman, not even as an inconvenient fiancée, but as a problem to be solved with money. Her heart constricted, a sharp, painful ache blooming in her chest. The air in the grand room felt suddenly thin, stifling. "You propose to buy me out of the engagement?" Eleanor asked, the words forced past her lips, heavy with disbelief and a nascent anger. Her emerald eyes, usually soft, now held a glint of defiance. The locket beneath her gown felt cold against her skin. Alaric raised an eyebrow, a subtle shift in his expression. "One could phrase it that way, yes," he conceded, a hint of something that might have been irritation in his voice. "Or more accurately, I am offering a mutually beneficial alternative, an opportunity for us both to avoid an unhappy marriage. You gain financial security, and I gain my independence." He folded his hands on the table, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence in his own logic. He truly believed this was a generous, logical solution. Eleanor stared at the document, her gaze fixed on the bold numbers written near the bottom, the sheer magnitude of the sum making her head spin. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than her father had lost, enough to save her family many times over. But the relief that should have come with that realization was swallowed by a wave of crushing humiliation. He saw her as something to be paid off, a complication to be neatly tidied away with gold. Her honor, her very being, had been reduced to a price tag. The thought of her father, desperate and broken, accepting this offer, filled her with a profound sense of shame. He would see it as salvation. She saw it as an ultimate insult. Her hands, which had been clutching each other, now began to clench into fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. A hot, prickling sensation spread through her, starting from her chest and rising to her face. He had never even considered her feelings, her hopes, however small they might have been for a life, any life, free from the crushing weight of her family's ruin. He had simply calculated, assessed, and presented his solution, as if she were a mere item on a balance sheet. The cold, logical practicality of his offer was more devastating than any outright rejection. It stripped her of all human value, leaving only her perceived market price. Eleanor lifted her head slowly, her eyes, though clouded with emotion, now held a fierce, unwavering resolve. She looked at Alaric, at his perfect, unfeeling face, at his piercing blue eyes that held no compassion. He truly did not understand. He could not grasp the depth of the insult he had just delivered. Her breath hitched in her throat, a desperate struggle for composure. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken words and raw emotions. She felt a tremor run through her body, a mixture of shock, the bitter sting of humiliation, and a sudden burning anger she didn't know she possessed. It was an anger born of violated pride, of being treated as less than human. It surged through her veins, hot and potent, momentarily eclipsing the fear and despair. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel path leading to Thorn Castle, each revolution a stark reminder of the distance separating Eleanor's world from the Duke's. Days had passed since Alaric's brief, dismissive visit to Vance Manor. The summons had arrived just that morning, a crisp, formal note bearing the Duke's imposing seal, requesting her immediate presence at Thorn Castle for a private discussion. Eleanor had dressed in her best, albeit faded emerald gown, hoping to project a dignity she felt slipping away with each passing hour. A faint tremor ran through her fingers as she clutched the worn leather strap inside the carriage. Her stomach tightened into a knot. What could he possibly want now? She had expected a meeting to discuss the wedding details, perhaps the formal announcement. The chill that had traced her spine after overhearing Alaric's steward now felt like a tightening band around her chest. Thorn Castle loomed against the pale sky, a formidable presence of gray stone and towering turrets. It was not a home, Eleanor realized, but a fortress, a monument to power and ancient lineage. The carriage rolled through an immense archway, echoing her arrival through the silent courtyard. Servants dressed in pristine liveries moved with quiet efficiency, their faces impassive as they opened the carriage door. The air itself felt different here, colder, heavier, filled with the scent of aged stone and polished wood. Eleanor stepped out, her slender frame feeling utterly insignificant beneath the vastness of the castle walls. She straightened her shoulders, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming grandeur. A stern-faced butler, his expression as unyielding as the castle itself, led her through labyrinthine corridors. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting ancient battles and stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every step. Each grand room they passed, each gleaming set of armor, served to underscore the immense chasm between her family's decaying manor and the Duke's undeniable wealth. Her own worn slippers seemed to scuff too loudly on the polished marble floors. She could feel the faint chill permeating the stone, a coldness that seemed to seep into her very bones. Finally, they arrived at a vast drawing room. The butler announced her name with a deep, resonant voice that seemed to swallow the air. Duke Alaric Thorne stood by an enormous fireplace, its mantelpiece adorned with elaborate carvings. He did not turn immediately, instead gazing into the dying embers, his back to her. The room was breathtaking in its opulence, yet it felt utterly devoid of warmth. Rich velvet drapes, the color of claret wine, hung from impossibly high windows. A crystal chandelier, glittering like frozen tears, dominated the ceiling. Yet, despite the lavish display, there was a stark, almost clinical order to everything, an impersonal perfection that left Eleanor feeling exposed and vulnerable. Alaric finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, emphasizing his broad shoulders and commanding presence. His piercing blue eyes, like shards of ice, swept over her, a brief, assessing glance that held no warmth, no recognition of her as a person. He offered no greeting, no gesture of welcome. His face remained impassive, betraying nothing of his thoughts. He simply looked at her, his silence more unnerving than any sharp word. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She gripped her hands tightly in front of her, trying to still their slight tremble. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice deep and resonant, yet devoid of any inflection that might suggest personal interest. It was the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, not engaging in polite conversation. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He gestured vaguely towards a large, polished mahogany table in the center of the room. On it lay a single crisp parchment, neatly folded. "Please be seated." Eleanor moved towards the table, her steps feeling oddly heavy. She settled into one of the ornate, high-backed chairs, its velvet cold against her skin. Alaric took the opposite seat, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her shrink slightly under his scrutiny. He picked up the document, his long fingers carefully unfolding it. The faint rustle of the parchment was the only sound in the vast room. He pushed it across the table toward her. "I have had my solicitors prepare this for you," Alaric stated, his voice flat, emotionless. He watched her, waiting for her reaction. His blue eyes seemed to bore into her, leaving her no place to hide. Eleanor looked at the document, then back at him, a flicker of confusion in her emerald eyes. She saw the heavy seals, the elegant script, the formal language of legal proceedings. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. "What is this, Your Grace?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper, betraying the sudden fear that gnawed at her. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers tracing the edge of the parchment without touching the words. Alaric leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanging. "It is an offer, Lady Eleanor. A fair and generous one, I believe, considering the circumstances." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "It is a financial settlement for you and your family, a substantial sum designed to alleviate your current difficulties and ensure your future comfort." Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her. A financial settlement? Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the meaning behind his cold, precise words. She stared at the document, the ornate letters blurring before her eyes. He was not discussing wedding plans. He was not talking about their future together. He was talking about money. "I fail to understand, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Her pride, a fragile shield, began to crack. "Allow me to clarify," Alaric continued, his tone patient, as if explaining a complex business transaction to a slow-witted clerk. "This engagement, as you know, was arranged for pragmatic reasons, to unite our families, to provide a solution to your family's financial predicament." He paused, a flicker of something, perhaps impatience in his eyes. "However, I have come to believe it is an unsuitable match for both of us." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Unsuitable match. He spoke of her as if she were a faulty ledger entry, an inconvenient calculation. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck, hot and mortifying. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. Her delicate features tightened. "This settlement," Alaric pressed on, seemingly oblivious to her rising distress, "would provide your family with enough capital to clear their debts, restore Vance Manor, and establish a comfortable allowance for you. It would free you from the necessity of marrying for financial security." He gestured to the document with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "And of course, it would free me from an arrangement that, while perhaps politically expedient, offers little else." He spoke as if he were discussing a trade deal, a land acquisition, anything but her life, her future, her very person. The casual indifference in his voice was a physical blow. He saw her not as a woman, not even as an inconvenient fiancée, but as a problem to be solved with money. Her heart constricted, a sharp, painful ache blooming in her chest. The air in the grand room felt suddenly thin, stifling. "You propose to buy me out of the engagement?" Eleanor asked. The words forced past her lips, heavy with disbelief and a nascent anger. Her emerald eyes, usually soft, now held a glint of defiance. The locket beneath her gown felt cold against her skin. Alaric raised an eyebrow, a subtle shift in his expression. "One could phrase it that way, yes," he conceded, a hint of something that might have been irritation in his voice. "Or more accurately, I am offering a mutually beneficial alternative. An opportunity for us both to avoid an unhappy marriage. You gain financial security and I gain my independence." He folded his hands on the table, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence in his own logic. He truly believed this was a generous, logical solution. Eleanor stared at the document, her gaze fixed on the bold numbers written near the bottom, the sheer magnitude of the sum making her head spin. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than her father had lost, enough to save her family many times over. But the relief that should have come with that realization was swallowed by a wave of crushing humiliation. He saw her as something to be paid off, a complication to be neatly tidied away with gold. Her honor, her very being, had been reduced to a price tag. The thought of her father, desperate and broken, accepting this offer filled her with a profound sense of shame. He would see it as salvation. She saw it as an ultimate insult. Her hands, which had been clutching each other, now began to clench into fists beneath the table, her nail digging into her palms. A hot, prickling sensation spread through her, starting from her chest and rising to her face. He had never even considered her feelings, her hopes, however small they might have been for a life, any life, free from the crushing weight of her family's ruin. He had simply calculated, assessed, and presented his solution, as if she were a mere item on a balance sheet. The cold, logical practicality of his offer was more devastating than any outright rejection. It stripped her of all human value, leaving only her perceived market price. Eleanor lifted her head slowly, her eyes, though clouded with emotion, now held a fierce, unwavering resolve. She looked at Alaric, at his perfect, unfeeling face, at his piercing blue eyes that held no compassion. He truly did not understand. He could not grasp the depth of the insult he had just delivered. Her breath hitched in her throat, a desperate struggle for composure. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken words and raw emotions. She felt a tremor run through her body, a mixture of shock, the bitter sting of humiliation, and a sudden burning anger she didn't know she possessed. It was an anger born of violated pride, of being treated as less than human. It surged through her veins, hot and potent, momentarily eclipsing the fear and despair. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel path leading away from Thorn Castle, each revolution a painful reminder of the Duke's cold proposition. Eleanor sat rigidly, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The luxurious velvet seat, meant for comfort, felt like a cage, pressing in on her as the afternoon light outside began to fade into a somber gray. A bitter taste coated her tongue, a phantom echo of the humiliation she had just endured. Her mind replayed the Duke's clipped words, the indifferent flick of his wrist as he dismissed her worth, reducing her existence to a mere financial transaction. The heavy air of the castle, thick with the scent of old money and unfeeling power, still clung to her clothes, a suffocating shroud. She looked out the window at the passing fields, their greens muted under the darkening sky, feeling disconnected from the world. Each sway of the carriage, each jolt, seemed to echo the turmoil within her chest. Her breath caught in her throat, a knot of anger and sorrow tightening with every mile. She had come to Thorn Castle with a fragile hope, a desperate willingness to fulfill a duty, to sacrifice her own desires for her family's survival. Instead, she had been offered a payout, a final, definitive statement that she was nothing more than a problem to be solved with currency. The thought stung, burning behind her eyes. When the carriage finally turned onto the overgrown lane leading to Vance Manor, the familiar sight brought no comfort. The once proud stone walls now looked weary, the ivy clinging to them like desperate fingers. The air here was damp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of Thorn Castle. As the carriage slowed, Eleanor felt a tremor run through her. She was home, but the burden she carried felt heavier than ever. A young stable boy, Thomas, rushed forward to open the door, his face etched with concern as he saw her pale complexion. "Lady Eleanor," he murmured, his voice soft. She managed a weak smile, stepping down onto the muddy ground. The chill seeped into her thin boots, a coldness that mirrored the one spreading through her heart. The front door of the manor stood slightly ajar, revealing the shadowed hall within. The familiar scent of old wood, dust, and damp linen greeted her, a scent that had once been comforting, now felt heavy with unspoken worries. She walked through the silent house, her footsteps echoing on the worn marble tiles. The tapestries, once vibrant, now hung faded and threadbare, absorbing the last vestiges of daylight. A faint chill permeated the air, a constant companion in the older sections of the manor. Eleanor found her father, Baron Frederick Vance, in his study, huddled by a meager fire that offered more smoke than warmth. He looked even frailer than she remembered from that morning, his shoulders hunched, a thin blanket draped over his knees. The parchment he had been reading lay forgotten in his lap, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. A faint, persistent cough racked his chest as she entered. "Father," she said, her voice sounding raspy even to her own ears. He started, looking up with eyes that were tired and clouded with worry. "Eleanor, my dear, you are back. How did it go? Did he set a date?" His voice was weak, laced with an almost desperate hope that pricked at her already raw nerves. He shifted, trying to rise, but she gently placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to remain seated. The warmth of his skin, thin and papery beneath her fingers, only heightened her sense of responsibility. She sat on the edge of the worn leather armchair opposite him, the springs groaning softly under her weight. The light from the single candle flickering on his desk cast long dancing shadows around the room, making the familiar space feel alien and foreboding. She hesitated, searching for the right words, but the enormity of the Duke's insult made articulation difficult. "He did not set a date, Father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. The bitter taste returned, sharp and unyielding. "The Duke, he has made an alternative proposal." Her father's eyes, which had briefly flickered with a desperate hope, now clouded with confusion. "An alternative? What could be an alternative to the marriage, Eleanor? Our agreement was clear. Our family's future rests upon this alliance." He reached out, his frail hand gripping her arm, his touch surprisingly strong with underlying anxiety. She could feel the tremor in his fingers. "He offered money," she stated flatly, the words feeling foreign and wrong on her tongue. "A substantial sum, Father, to release both of us from the engagement, to allow us to go our separate ways." The Baron's grip slackened. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. his expression slowly transforming from confusion to disbelief, then to a dawning, incredulous hope. He coughed again, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to shake his entire frame. The scent of stale pipe tobacco and old paper filled the small study. "Money," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "How substantial, Eleanor?" She swallowed, the dryness in her throat making it difficult. "Enough," he said, "to settle our debts, to restore Vance Manor, to ensure our comfort for years to come." She did not mention the exact figure, the vulgar number that still echoed in her ears, a price tag on her heart. The implication alone felt like a wound. Her father's eyes widened, a flicker of something she had not seen in them for months. Hope, raw and untamed, ignited. He pushed himself upright, the blankets sliding to the floor. "Enough, you say? Enough to truly save us?" He looked around the shabby study, his gaze lingering on the peeling wallpaper and the damp stain on the ceiling, as if imagining them instantly restored. "Eleanor, this is a miracle, a true blessing." He tried to smile, but the expression was strained, etched with the years of worry that had ravaged his face. "We must accept, my dear. We simply must. Think of what this means. No more sleepless nights, no more creditors at the door. Vance Manor, restored to its former glory. Your future, secured." He reached for her hands, his grip tight, his eyes pleading. "You can finally be free, Eleanor, from this burden, from this marriage you never truly wished for." His words, meant to reassure, pierced her instead. Free? The Duke's offer was not freedom. It was a deeper kind of enslavement, a public declaration that her honor, her very essence, could be quantified and discarded. She felt a cold dread creep into her stomach, a sickening feeling that turned her blood to ice. He saw her as a commodity, something to be purchased and then removed, an inconvenient truth swept away with enough coin. "Father," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "it is not that simple." "But it is, Eleanor," he interrupted, his voice gaining a strength she had not heard in months. His sudden animation, fueled by desperate hope, made him seem almost feverish. "This is our chance, our only chance. Do you not see? The Duke is offering us a way out, a path to solvency without demanding the sacrifice of your happiness in a loveless marriage." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I know this marriage was a heavy cross for you to bear, my child. But now, this offer, it allows you to choose your own path, eventually. To perhaps find a love that is real, not merely a transaction for our family's good." His interpretation of the Duke's motives, so pure and hopeful, twisted the knife in her heart. He saw generosity where she saw only dismissiveness, kindness where she felt utter contempt. The Duke had not offered her freedom. He had offered to buy her silence, to buy her out of his life. He had wanted to escape the inconvenience of a woman like her, a woman whose family had fallen, whose very presence at his side would be a slight blemish on his otherwise perfect, powerful world. Eleanor pulled her hands gently from her father's grasp. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the deepening twilight. The world outside was blurring into shadows, much like her own future. A profound sense of injury settled deep within her bones. The Duke, with his cool detachment, had managed to strip her of something far more valuable than wealth. He had tried to strip her of her dignity, her intrinsic worth as a human being. She remembered her mother's words, spoken years ago as she polished the Vance family locket, its silver glinting in the firelight. "Honor, Eleanor," her mother had said, her voice soft but firm, "is the only true treasure we possess. It cannot be bought, nor can it be sold. It is what defines a Vance, even when all else is lost." Those words, once a comforting echo of her heritage, now rang with a painful clarity. The Duke's offer was a direct challenge to everything her mother had taught her, everything she believed in. A wave of nausea washed over her. Her hands felt clammy, a dull ache beginning behind her eyes. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to quell the rising tide of emotions. The truth, stark and brutal, hit her with the force of a physical blow. The Duke saw her as a problem, a disposable item, something less than human. He had not considered her feelings, her honor, her very soul. He had seen only the financial cost of disentanglement. "He sees me as a problem to be solved with money, Father," she finally said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. She turned back to face him, her eyes burning. "He does not see me at all. He sees a family in debt, a reputation tarnished, and a woman who can be bought and silenced with a generous enough sum." Her father looked bewildered by her intensity. "But Eleanor, what does it matter how he sees you if the outcome is salvation for us all? Are we to starve, to lose this house, to live in shame, simply because of a duke's pride? His pride has offered us a way out. My dear, you must be practical." He stood and walked toward her, his movements slow and labored. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm, then settling on her shoulder. The weight of his touch was heavy, laden with his own desperation. "Practicality cannot mend a broken spirit, Father," she whispered, pulling away. A sudden coldness enveloped her, a chilling realization that she stood alone in this battle. Her father, blinded by the promise of financial relief, could not comprehend the depth of her wound. He saw only the numbers, the tangible salvation, not the intangible cost to her soul. The bitter scent of the dying fire mingled with the rising anguish in her throat. She thought of the years of struggle, the careful mending of her gowns, the quiet sacrifices, the constant worry gnawing at the edges of their lives. She had borne it all with dignity, clinging to her pride as a shield against the encroaching despair. But this offer, this cold, transactional dismissal of her worth, was a different kind of burden. It threatened to shatter not just her family's fortunes, but her very sense of self. Her breath hitched. She walked away from her father, away from the flickering candlelight, and made her way up the grand, sweeping staircase. Each step creaked under her weight, a mournful sound in the silent house. The banister, once polished and smooth, felt rough beneath her fingers, scarred by neglect. She walked past portraits of her ancestors, their stern, honorable faces seeming to judge her from the shadows. Had they ever faced such a dilemma? Had their honor ever been so explicitly put up for sale? She reached her room, a sanctuary that now felt like a prison. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the dried sachets in her wardrobe. She lit a single candle on her dressing table, its flame casting a soft yellow glow on the familiar space. Her reflection in the tarnished mirror stared back at her, eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears, her face pale and drawn. She looked like a stranger, a ghost of her former self. Her hand instinctively went to her neck, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the Vance family locket. She pulled it from beneath her simple, worn gown. The silver, usually a comforting presence, felt heavy, weighted with the expectations of generations. Her thumb traced the intricate engraving of the Vance crest, a small, defiant symbol of her heritage. The image of her parents, young and smiling in the miniature portraits within, brought a fresh wave of agony. They represented a time when the Vance name carried weight, when honor was an unspoken assumption, not a battle to be fought. Her mother's face, serene and strong, seemed to look at her from the tiny frame, her emerald eyes mirroring Eleanor's own. The memory of her mother's voice, clear and unwavering, speaking of integrity and self-respect, echoed in the quiet room. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek, cold against her skin. It was followed by another and then another, until a silent deluge streamed down her face. Her throat tightened, a painful constriction that made it impossible to speak. The humiliation, the profound sense of being devalued, overwhelmed her. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a desperate drumbeat of pain. She closed her eyes, the locket pressed tightly against her chest, feeling the cold weight of it against her skin. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she clutches her locket, whispering, "Is this truly all I am worth?" The last tear had dried on Eleanor's cheek, leaving a faint, salty trace. The question, "Is this truly all I am worth?" echoed in the hollow chambers of her mind. She lay in her bed, but sleep remained a distant, mocking stranger. The old four-poster, once grand, now felt like a cage, its faded velvet canopy a shroud against the world outside. Moonlight, thin and watery, painted stark patterns across the threadbare rug. Every creak of the ancient manor seemed to sigh with her own despair. Her fingers still clutched the Vance family locket, its cool silver a small anchor in the churning sea of her emotions. Her mother's face, captured within its delicate frame, seemed to look back at her, serene and unyielding. Eleanor remembered her mother's voice, soft but firm, speaking of honor. A Vance, her mother had once said, carries not just a name, but a legacy. That legacy is built on integrity, Eleanor, on dignity that no fortune can buy or take away. Those words, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy burden. How could she uphold such a legacy when her family stood on the precipice of ruin? Her father's haggard face, his coughs echoing from his room downstairs, flashed before her eyes. He had seen the Duke's offer as salvation, a glorious escape from their destitution. His desperate plea for her to accept it still rang in her ears, a desperate siren song pulling her towards a compromise she felt in her very soul was wrong. Eleanor turned onto her side, the rough linen sheets scratching faintly against her skin. The air in the room was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and old wood. She pressed the locket against her chest, feeling the faint indentations of the engraved crest. This crest, this name had been her birthright, her identity. Now it felt like a brand, marking her as someone to be pitied, someone whose value could be calculated and dismissed. The Duke's cold, dismissive words replayed themselves. An unsuitable match, a substantial financial settlement. He had not even looked at her. Not truly. She was an inconvenience, a problem to be solved with money. The sheer arrogance of it, the assumption that her pride, her very being, had a price tag, burned through her. It was an insult far greater than their poverty. It was an assault on everything her mother had taught her, everything she believed defined a Vance. A knot tightened in her stomach. It was not just the shame of being bought, it was the injustice of being considered so utterly disposable. She was not a transaction. She was Eleanor Vance, daughter of a lineage that, though currently diminished, still held worth. Her family might have lost their wealth, but had they truly lost their honor? Was it truly gone, simply because a powerful man deemed it so? She rose from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The window, a rectangle of pale gray against the darker wall, drew her closer. Outside, the world was hushed, lost in the deep embrace of night. A single star glittered, a defiant pinprick of light in the vast darkness. Eleanor leaned her forehead against the cool glass, feeling the faint vibration of the wind against the pane. Her mind raced, cycling through scenarios. She could accept. Her father would be relieved. Their debts would be paid. Vance Manor, perhaps, saved from utter collapse. But what would be left of her? What would she see when she looked in the mirror, knowing she had sold her self-respect for coin? The thought twisted her insides, a far more painful prospect than any material hardship. Her mother's eyes, in the locket, seemed to hold a silent question. Had her mother, in all her gentleness, ever compromised her dignity? Never. Her mother had faced adversity with grace and an unwavering belief in their family's inherent worth. It was this strength, not their former riches, that Eleanor truly admired. It was this legacy she felt compelled to protect. A quiet anger, cold and steady, began to seep into her veins, replacing the hot, stinging humiliation. This was not about saving the Vance fortune. It was about saving the Vance name, the very soul of her family. If she accepted the Duke's money, she would confirm his low opinion of her. She would become exactly what he believed her to be, a commodity, easily purchased, easily discarded. No, a fierce, unyielding resolve began to solidify within her. She would not be bought. Her honor was not for sale. It was a priceless inheritance, passed down through generations, and she would guard it with every fiber of her being, even if it meant facing utter ruin. The thought brought a strange clarity, a sense of purpose she had not felt since the Duke's offer had shattered her fragile hopes. The injustice of it all fueled her. To be cast aside, deemed unworthy, then offered a pittance to soften the blow. It was an affront to her very existence. She would not let him erase her with his money. She would stand firm, a testament to the fact that some things, some people, could not be valued in gold. She walked to her small writing desk, a rickety piece of furniture inherited from her grandmother, its surface scarred by countless years of use. Her hands, usually trembling with anxiety, now moved with a surprising steadiness. The inkwell held only a small amount of dark liquid, but it would be enough. The quill, a feather from a common bird, felt substantial in her grasp. Eleanor pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment, its rough texture a contrast to the Duke's smooth official documents. She thought of the words she would use, rehearsing them in her mind. They needed to be precise, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, a stark reflection of the cold transaction he had proposed. She would mirror his detachment, but with a different intention. Her gaze fell upon the locket, still clutched in her left hand. The cool metal seemed to warm slightly under her touch, a small ember of strength. Her mother's lesson was clear: honor above all else. This was not a choice between poverty and comfort. It was a choice between self-respect and utter subjugation. A vision of her father, frail and defeated, flitted through her mind. A pang of guilt, sharp and quick, pierced her newfound resolve. Could she truly condemn him to further hardship? Her heart ached for him, for the gentle man who had tried his best, however misguided his attempts. But then she remembered his broken spirit, his willing acceptance of the Duke's offer as a means to an end. It was an acceptance born of despair, not of principle. She had to do this for herself, yes, but also for the unyielding spirit of her mother, for the legacy of their name, however tarnished it might seem to the world. She would not allow the Vance family to be remembered as those who sold their dignity. She would not allow herself to be remembered as the daughter who bartered her soul for comfort. The first rays of dawn, pale and hesitant, began to streak across the sky, chasing away the shadows of the long night. The room slowly gained definition, revealing the familiar contours of her humble existence. She could hear the faint stirrings of the manor below, the distant clatter of a pot, the quiet steps of a servant. The world was awakening, and so was she. Eleanor dipped the quill into the inkwell. The scent of the ink, earthy and metallic, filled her nostrils. Her breath hitched slightly, a small tremor running through her. This was it. The moment of decision had passed. Now came the action. She would not be accepting his generous offer. She would not be disappearing quietly with his money. She would confront him not with anger, but with an unshakable conviction that her worth was not quantifiable. She would look him in the eye, something he had failed to do, and assert her autonomy. The words formed themselves in her mind, clear and unwavering. I request a final audience, not a plea but a demand, cloaked in civility. She would not be dismissed so easily. She would ensure he understood the gravity of his insult, not through emotional outbursts, but through calm, reasoned refusal. Her hand, as she brought the quill to the parchment, still trembled slightly. It was not a tremble of fear, but of the sheer weight of what she was about to do. It was the tremble of a fragile human spirit finding an unexpected fierce strength. It was the tremble of a heart beating with a newfound courage, ready to face down a duke and reclaim her destiny. The quiet resolve hardened into an unyielding steel. With a newfound strength, Eleanor pens a terse note to the Duke requesting a final audience, her hand trembling, but her resolve firm. The carriage wheels crunched in on the gravel drive of Thorn Castle. This sound echoed the tension deep in Lady Eleanor Vance's chest. The air inside felt thick, pressing down on her lungs. She gripped her gloved hands, the worn fabric doing little to stop the tremor. Her gaze fixed on the imposing stone facade. The dark windows seemed to watch her. She still felt the ache of her father's desperate pleas, his anxieties clinging to her simple gown. Each heartbeat drummed against her ribs, a rhythm of dread and stubborn defiance. A footman opened the door, and cool, crisp air swept into the carriage. It carried the faint smell of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Eleanor stepped out, her worn leather shoes sinking into the fine gravel. She straightened her spine, a silent prayer for strength forming on her lips. The enormous oak doors of the castle loomed. Their dark wood reflected the weak morning light. Inside, the grand hall was vast, echoing with a cool, impersonal silence. A servant, his face impassive, led her through corridors. Each step on the cold stone reminded her of the distance between her world and the Duke's. They reached the opulent study where Alaric first made his offer. The room felt larger, more intimidating now. Towering bookshelves lined the walls. Dark leather chairs sat before a massive mahogany desk. A grand fireplace glowed with faint embers, casting dancing shadows. The air was dry and still, carrying the scent of old parchment in the Duke's crisp cologne. Eleanor's throat felt tight with fear and resolve. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere down the hall. Each tick hammered, marking seconds until her world shifted. Duke Alaric Thorne stood by the tall windows, his back to her. He looked out at the manicured grounds. His silhouette was sharp, unyielding. He did not turn immediately, letting the silence stretch. Eleanor scanned the room, noting patterns on the Persian rug. She saw the gleam of a silver inkwell. Heavy velvet drapes framed the world outside. Her heart hammered, but she held herself still, her gaze fixed on the Duke's broad shoulders. She clutched her hands again, feeling the soft rub of her worn gloves. The silence hummed with unspoken expectations. Finally, Alaric turned. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers across the room. They held their usual cool indifference, perhaps a hint of impatience. He gestured toward an armchair opposite his desk. Eleanor walked forward, her steps measured, her gaze steady. She refused to drop her eyes. She felt the subtle shift in the air, a sense of intrusion into his ordered world. Somehow, she did not sit. She stood before the desk, her slight figure framed against the rich dark wood. The contrast was stark, his tailored suit against her mended gown. Her palms felt damp inside her gloves. Lady Eleanor, Alaric's voice was low, smooth, devoid of warmth. I trust you have had ample time to consider my proposal. He leaned back against the desk, arms crossed, exuding easy confidence. He expected a grateful acceptance, perhaps a plea for more. Eleanor felt his silent assumption pressing down. She could almost taste its bitterness, a metallic tang on her tongue. She took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust and polished wood. Her gaze remained locked with his, unwavering. The emerald green of her eyes, usually soft, now held a fierce, unyielding light. She felt a tremor in her hands, a battle within. She willed her voice to be clear, firm, and steady. Duke Alaric, she began, her voice resonating in the quiet room. I have considered your proposal at length. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He unfolded his arms, pushing off the desk, leaning forward slightly. This was a subtle shift, acknowledging her presence, her unexpected strength. And what have you decided? He prompted, his voice even, but with a hint of challenge. Eleanor felt the full weight of the moment. Her father, pale and broken, flashed through her mind. Vance Manor crumbling into ruin, the end of generations of their lineage. It was a terrifying prospect. But then she heard her mother's voice. It spoke of honor, self-respect, things money could not buy. She remembered the burning humiliation of his first offer, feeling reduced to a mere transaction. I reject your financial settlement, Duke, Eleanor stated. Her voice held no wavering. The words hung in the air, stark and final. A tiny gasp escaped her lips, a reaction to her own audacity. The air in the room thickened. The silence grew heavy with shock. Alaric's composure fractured for a split second. His eyes widened, his jaw tightening. He expected negotiation, tears, or gratitude. Never this. The faint embers in the fireplace seemed to dim. A cold bead of sweat trickled down Eleanor's back. You reject it? Alaric repeated, his voice low, full of surprise. It was not a question, but an incredulous statement. He pushed off the desk, taking a step toward her. His tall frame grew more imposing. The sharp, expensive scent of his cologne strengthened. Yes, Duke, Eleanor affirmed, her gaze unwavering. A pulse throbbed at her temples. I reject it entirely. The sum, however generous, means nothing to me. She met his piercing stare, conveying the truth. Her hands, despite her efforts, trembled more noticeably. She tucked them behind her back, trying to conceal the weakness. Alaric stared at her. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and dawning, unwilling respect. He walked slowly around his desk, his eyes never leaving hers. The soft rustle of his suit fabric broke the silence. He reached the opposite side, placing his hands flat on the polished wood. He leaned forward slightly. The movement brought him closer, making her acutely aware of his presence. Lady Eleanor, he said, his voice colder, sharper. Do you understand what you are refusing? This offer would secure your family's future. It would lift them from ruin. It would allow you a life of comfort. He tried to reason, to bring her back to sanity. He reminded her of the desperation that brought her here. Eleanor took another breath. She tasted the metallic edge of her fear, but also the sweetness of her resolve. "I understand perfectly, Duke," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "I understand our financial distress and the shame it brings, my father's suffering." She closed her eyes for a moment, seeing Vance Manor's faded tapestries. She heard its creaking floors, felt the cold seep of neglect. It was a vision of ruin, but one she was prepared to face on her own terms. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. Her emerald eyes glistened slightly, though no tears fell. "My honor, Duke Alaric, is not for sale," she declared. Her voice rang with undeniable truth. "It is not a commodity. My self-respect, my very essence, cannot be quantified by any sum." She felt a strange surge of power, a liberation in speaking these truths aloud. The air felt charged with her raw emotion. Alaric's sharp features tightened. He was a man used to negotiations where everything had a price. Her words were alien, a challenge to his worldview. The scent of old books mingled with the intensity in the room. He leaned back, straightening, his hands clasped behind his back. He studied her, truly studied her, perhaps for the first time. "Are you truly prepared," he asked, his voice low, dangerously quiet, "to condemn your family to complete ruin? To see Vance Manor lost, your father disgraced, simply for this abstract notion of honor?" He spoke honor as if it were foolish, impractical. He was probing, pushing, trying to find a crack in her resolve. He challenged her to face the full consequences. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of fear, cold and sharp. Her father's despair, the potential loss of everything, was a crushing weight. Her stomach churned. A nervous flutter rose in her chest. Doubt threatened to consume her. The warmth of the locket beneath her dress, her family's symbol, felt like comfort and burden. She remembered the look in her father's eyes, the shame. But then she thought of the alternative. Accepting his money, living a life bought by humiliation, trading dignity for survival. It felt like a slow, insidious death. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant chime of the grandfather clock. She knew she could not live with that. She drew on a strength she did not know she possessed. "Yes, Duke," she replied, her voice a whisper, yet filled with unshakable conviction. "I am prepared. If our ruin is the price of maintaining my honor, then I will pay it." A single tear, unbidden, escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek. Her gaze remained firm, resolute. It was not a tear of regret, but of profound sadness. She tasted the salt of it on her lips. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "I will not be bought. I will not allow myself or my family's name to become an entry in your ledgers. There are some things, Duke, that money cannot purchase, and my self-respect is one of them." Her hands, still hidden, clenched so tightly her fingernails bit into her palms. The pain was a small anchor in the storm raging within her. Alaric stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her. He absorbed every word, every subtle tremor, every defiant spark. The initial shock had given way to something far more complex. He saw the single tear, the fierce resolve, the genuine pain. His meticulously ordered world, where every problem had a financial solution, felt askew. He saw not a desperate noblewoman, but a creature of fierce integrity. She stood before him with nothing but her convictions. The air crackled with their unspoken confrontation, a clash of two worlds. He watched her, a woman who dared reject his power, his wealth, his definition of security. A quiet sense of unease, unfamiliar and unsettling, stirred within him. Her refusal was not a tactic. It was a profound act of self-assertion. It was an absolute denial of his ability to dictate her worth. Alaric, caught completely off guard, stared at her, his usual composure shattered. A flicker of something he could not quite identify sparked in his eyes. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel path leading away from Thorn Castle, a sound that usually signified a return to quiet order. Eleanor, however, felt a strange dissonance. Her body ached with a profound exhaustion, yet a fierce, almost thrilling energy pulsed beneath her skin. The rich scent of polished oak and old velvet, lingering from the Duke's grand halls, still clung to her simple gown. She could still feel the weight of his stunned silence, the unexpected shift in his piercing blue eyes. Her fingers found the familiar coolness of her locket, a small anchor against the tumultuous sea within her. Had she truly done it? Had she, Lady Eleanor Vance, truly refused the Duke's vast fortune, casting aside the salvation of her family for an abstract concept like honor? A tremor ran through her, a mix of terrifying doubt and exhilarating pride. The silence of the carriage amplified the frantic beating of her own heart. She remembered her voice, clear and steady, declaring her principles. It was a voice she barely recognized as her own, born from a corner of her spirit she rarely dared to explore. Her gaze fell upon her worn leather gloves, their seams frayed. The air in the carriage felt thin, almost too keen, as if every breath was a precious commodity. She could still see the glimmer in Alaric's eyes, the way his composure had fractured. It was a small victory, perhaps a foolish one, but it was hers. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of release. For the burden of silence in compliance had finally lifted. She felt a lightness, a terrifying freedom that tasted both sweet and bitter. Back at Vance Manor, the familiar scent of damp earth and fading rosewater offered a different kind of solace. The quiet halls, once a source of suffocating despair, now seemed to embrace her with a fragile understanding. Her father was nowhere to be seen, lost perhaps in the studies he preferred over facing reality. Eleanor moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps barely disturbing the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Each step felt deliberate, a testament to the difficult choice she had made. The news, as whispers often do, began to travel. It started as a hushed comment among servants, then a scandalized murmur in drawing rooms, finally reaching the ears of the aristocracy. The Duke, the formidable Duke Alaric Thorne, had been rejected, not for his person, but for his money, and by a disgraced baron's daughter, no less. It was an unprecedented affront, a defiance that titillated and astonished. The idea of a lady refusing wealth, especially when her family stood on the precipice of ruin, was almost unthinkable. This was not a refusal born of pique or girlish fancy. This was a deliberate, principled stand. Eleanor heard fragments of it, distorted echoes of her actions. A cook mentioning the odd glances from the village baker, a housemaid speaking of a delivery boy's wide-eyed tale. Some saw her as a fool, others as a saint, but none could deny the sheer audacity of her choice. She understood the judgment, the confused pity, but she held on to her truth. The whispers, though unsettling, could not pierce the newfound core of her resolve. Meanwhile, at Thorne Castle, the Duke found himself in an unfamiliar state of disquiet. The grand silence of his study, usually a sanctuary for cold calculation and strategic thought, now seemed to echo with an unexpected sound, the memory of Eleanor's voice. He sat at his massive oak desk, the heavy ledgers open before him, yet his eyes did not truly see the figures. Instead, he saw her, standing before him, her slender frame unwavering, her emerald eyes alight with a conviction he rarely encountered. He had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even a quiet, resentful acceptance. He had prepared for a swift, clean transaction, a simple exchange of coin for convenience. What he received instead was a refusal steeped in a dignity that cut through his practiced indifference. He clenched his jaw, recalling her words, "My honor is not for sale." The very phrase grated against his cynical worldview, yet it resonated with an unsettling power. Alaric ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of agitation. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to anticipate their desires and their weaknesses. Yet Eleanor Vance had proven an enigma. She had cast aside the very thing his world valued above all else. And for what? An intangible, elusive concept. He had seen fear in her eyes, yes, a deep, underlying sorrow, but also an unyielding strength that defied her fragile appearance. He rose from his desk, pacing the length of the opulent room. The tapestries on the walls, depicting ancient battles and heroic figures, offered no answers. The faint scent of pipe tobacco, an indulgence from earlier, did little to soothe his restless mind. He paused before a tall window, looking out at the meticulously manicured gardens, the perfect geometry of his domain. His world was one of order, of predictable outcomes, of power wielded and respected. Eleanor had introduced a chaotic, deeply personal element into that order. He had encountered defiance before, of course, from rivals and lesser lords. But it was always predictable, always rooted in a desire for power or wealth. This was different. This was a defiance born of an internal fire, a quiet integrity that refused compromise. It challenged his understanding of human nature, particularly that of a woman in her desperate circumstances. He had offered a solution, a generous escape, and she had thrown it back at him, not with anger, but with an almost serene resolution. The memory of her unwavering gaze, those striking emerald eyes that held both pain and an incandescent spirit, settled upon him. He usually dismissed such details, focusing instead on quantifiable assets, on alliances and ledgers. But Eleanor's eyes were not an asset he could acquire, nor a weakness he could exploit. They held a reflection of something he could not quite grasp, something that disturbed the cold calculation he usually reserved for such matters. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel path leading away from Thorn Castle, a sound that usually signified a return to quiet order. Eleanor, however, felt a strange dissonance. Her body ached with a profound exhaustion, yet a fierce, almost thrilling energy pulsed beneath her skin. The rich scent of polished oak and old velvet, lingering from the Duke's grand halls, still clung to her simple gown. She could still feel the weight of his stunned silence, the unexpected shift in his piercing blue eyes. Her fingers found the familiar coolness of her locket, a small anchor against the tumultuous sea within her. Had she truly done it? Had she, Lady Eleanor Vance, truly refused the Duke's vast fortune, casting aside the salvation of her family for an abstract concept like honor? A tremor ran through her, a mix of terrifying doubt and exhilarating pride. The silence of the carriage amplified the frantic beating of her own heart. She remembered her voice, clear and steady, declaring her principles. It was a voice she barely recognized as her own, born from a corner of her spirit she rarely dared to explore. Her gaze fell upon her worn leather gloves, their seams frayed. The air in the carriage felt thin, almost too keen, as if every breath was a precious commodity. She could still see the glimmer in Alaric's eyes, the way his composure had fractured. It was a small victory, perhaps a foolish one, but it was hers. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of release, for the burden of silence and compliance had finally lifted. She felt a lightness, a terrifying freedom that tasted both sweet and bitter. Back at Vance Manor, the familiar scent of damp earth and fading rosewater offered a different kind of solace. The quiet halls, once a source of suffocating despair, now seemed to embrace her with a fragile understanding. Her father was nowhere to be seen, lost perhaps in the studies he preferred over facing reality. Eleanor moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps barely disturbing the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Each step felt deliberate, a testament to the difficult choice she had made. The news, as whispers often do, began to travel. It started as a hushed comment among servants, then a scandalized murmur in drawing rooms, finally reaching the ears of the aristocracy. The Duke, the formidable Duke Alaric Thorn, had been rejected. Not for his person, but for his money. And by a disgraced baron's daughter, no less. It was an unprecedented affront, a defiance that titillated and astonished. The idea of a lady refusing wealth, especially when her family stood on the precipice of ruin, was almost unthinkable. This was not a refusal born of pique or girlish fancy. This was a deliberate, principled stand. Eleanor heard fragments of it, distorted echoes of her actions. A cook mentioning the odd glances from the village baker. A housemaid speaking of a delivery boy's wide-eyed tale. Some saw her as a fool, others as a saint, but none could deny the sheer audacity of her choice. She understood the judgment, the confused pity, but she held on to her truth. The whispers, though unsettling, could not pierce the newfound core of her resolve. Meanwhile, at Thorn Castle, the Duke found himself in an unfamiliar state of disquiet. The grand silence of his study, usually a sanctuary for cold calculation and strategic thought, now seemed to echo with an unexpected sound, the memory of Eleanor's voice. He sat at his massive oak desk, the heavy ledgers open before him, yet his eyes did not truly see the figures. Instead, he saw her, standing before him, her slender frame unwavering, her emerald eyes alight with a conviction he rarely encountered. He had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even a quiet, resentful acceptance. He had prepared for a swift, clean transaction, a simple exchange of coin for convenience. What he received instead was a refusal steeped in a dignity that cut through his practiced indifference. He clenched his diamond, recalling her words, "My honor is not for sale." The very phrase grated against his cynical worldview, yet it resonated with an unsettling power. Alaric ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of agitation. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to anticipate their desires and their weaknesses. Yet, Eleanor Vance had proven an enigma. She had cast aside the very thing his world valued above all else, and for what? An intangible, elusive concept. He had seen fear in her eyes, yes, a deep, underlying sorrow, but also an unyielding strength that defied her fragile appearance. He rose from his desk, pacing the length of the opulent room. The tapestries on the walls, depicting ancient battles and heroic figures, offered no answers. The faint scent of pipe tobacco, an indulgence from earlier, did little to soothe his restless mind. He paused before a tall window, looking out at the meticulously manicured gardens, the perfect geometry of his domain. His world was one of order, of predictable outcomes, of power wielded and respected. Eleanor had introduced a chaotic, deeply personal element into that order. He had encountered defiance before, of course, from rivals and lesser lords, but it was always predictable, always rooted in a desire for power or wealth. This was different. This was a defiance born of an internal fire, a quiet integrity that refused compromise. It challenged his understanding of human nature, particularly that of a woman in her desperate circumstances. He had offered a solution, a generous escape, and she had thrown it back at him not with anger, but with an almost serene resolution. The memory of her unwavering gaze, those striking emerald eyes that held both pain and an incandescent spirit, settled upon him. He usually dismissed such details, focusing instead on quantifiable assets, on alliances and ledgers. But Eleanor's eyes were not an asset he could acquire, nor a weakness he could exploit. They held a reflection of something he could not quite grasp, something that disturbed the cold calculation he usually reserved for such matters. A restless shadow clung to Duke Alaric Thorne, refusing to dissipate even in the opulent silence of Thorne Castle. Eleanor Vance's emerald eyes, flashing with defiance, had etched themselves into his memory. He tried to dismiss them as an inconvenient distraction, an anomaly in his perfectly ordered world. But her image persisted, an unexpected tremor in his otherwise steady thoughts. He had expected pleas, tears, perhaps even a calculated acceptance of his offer. Instead, she had offered him her unwavering dignity, a currency he had forgotten existed. He found himself pacing the polished floors of his study, the rich Persian rugs muffling his footsteps. The scent of old leather and beeswax filled the air, a familiar comfort that now felt hollow. The financial settlement, once a clear solution, now seemed a crude instrument, utterly inadequate against the force of her spirit. He had viewed her as a transaction, a problem to be solved with gold. Her refusal had not just rejected his money, it had rejected his entire premise, his cold, pragmatic understanding of human worth. A strange, unfamiliar curiosity began to gnaw at him. He wanted to understand the woman who had dared to stand against him. He began to ride out more frequently, his destination subtly altered to pass near Vance Manor. He would never approach, never announce his presence. He simply observed, a distant figure on horseback, cloaked in the early morning mists or the long shadows of late afternoon. His first few excursions yielded little. The manor itself seemed to sag under the weight of its neglect, its once proud facade marred by peeling paint and shuttered windows. Yet, even from afar, he noticed a certain order amidst the decay, a meticulousness that spoke of constant, quiet effort. One bustling afternoon he saw her. She was in the front garden, not tending to flowers, but speaking with an elderly stable hand, her head tilted slightly, her hands clasped before her. Her simple dress, a muted green, blended with the muted landscape, but her posture commanded attention. She listened intently, her expression serious yet kind, a small smile gracing her lips as the old man gestured with animation. Alaric, hidden by a cluster of ancient oak trees, felt a tightening in his chest. He saw no hint of the desperate, broken noblewoman he had imagined. He saw composure, a quiet strength that transcended her circumstances. He rode closer on subsequent days, maintaining a careful distance, just enough to catch snippets of daily life at Vance Manor. He saw Eleanor carrying a basket of freshly laundered linens, her steps light despite the burden. He saw her kneeling in the smaller, more private garden patch behind the manor, her fingers gently weeding around struggling rose bushes. The earth clung to her fingertips, yet her movements were graceful, almost reverent. He noted the careful mending on the collar of her day dresses, the precise way she gathered her hair, free of elaborate adornments. There was no pretense, no attempt to hide the reality of her life. Instead, she embraced it with an unyielding grace. The staff at Vance Manor, a dwindling few, moved with a quiet loyalty around her. He watched as she offered a warm garment to a young maid shivering in the cool morning air, her voice a low murmur he could not quite discern, but whose tone spoke of concern. He saw her share a simple meal with her father, Baron Vance, at a window overlooking the overgrown fields. Her hand would occasionally reach across the table, covering his, a silent reassurance in their shared struggle. He began to see that her kindness was not a performance. It was ingrained, a fundamental part of her being. His initial impression of her as a mere pawn in a financial game began to crumble. She was not a commodity. She was a steward of a fading legacy, a quiet warrior against the relentless tide of ruin. Her refusal of his money now made a profound, unsettling sense. It was not pride alone that drove her, he realized, but an adherence to a deeper code, one he had long since discarded in his pursuit of power and material wealth. He found himself inexplicably drawn to this quiet resistance, this unwavering dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. One late afternoon, as twilight began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Alaric saw her in the secluded garden, nestled beside the old stone wall. The air was cool, carrying the damp scent of earth and the distant call of an owl. She was alone, her head bowed. He dismounted, leading his horse into a copse of trees, closer than he had ever dared to venture. He could not hear her, but the tremor in her shoulders, the way she clutched something to her chest, spoke volumes. Her delicate features, usually composed and serene, were now etched with a profound sorrow. A single silent tear tracked a path down her cheek, catching the last light of the fading day like a tiny, fragile jewel. She lifted her hand slowly to her throat, her fingers locking around the silver locket she often wore. Her knuckles were white from the pressure, as if she held onto it for dear life, as if it were the last anchor in a storm. A soft, almost inaudible sigh escaped her lips, a sound of deep, personal pain. Alaric felt a sharp, unexpected pang in his own chest. It was not pity, it was something far more complex, a sudden, searing recognition of her humanity. He had only ever seen her as an obstacle, a name on a contract, a means to an end. Now, watching her in this raw, unguarded moment, she was simply Eleanor. He saw the weight of her family's fate pressing down on her, the quiet despair she carried, the loneliness of her struggle. Her vulnerability was not a weakness. It was a testament to the depth of her feelings, the burden she bore with such stoic grace. His carefully constructed world, built on transactional relationships and cold logic, shuddered. He saw her not as a baron's daughter, nor as a potential bride, nor even as the woman who had defied him. He saw a woman of profound feeling, a soul burdened by circumstances, yet unbroken in spirit. The sight of her quiet grief, her struggle to maintain composure even in solitude, carved a new impression onto his guarded heart. The cold calculation he usually reserved for such matters vanished, replaced by a stirring he could not define. He watched her for a long time, hidden by the shadows of the ancient garden wall. She eventually straightened, drawing a quiet breath, and turned her attention to a neglected rose bush. Its thorns were many, its blooms few and fading, yet she reached out, her fingers gently touching a single wilting petal. A profound sense of respect, and a hint of something more, stirred within him. The image of the rose bush, its thorns pricking Eleanor's fingers, stayed with Alaric. Thorncastle felt cold after he left Vance Manor, its vast halls silent. His chambers, usually a calm place, now offered no peace. He paced the thick Persian rug, his mind restless. He remembered her face, pale but firm, standing before him. Her emerald eyes, once filled with despair, had flared with unexpected defiance. He had offered a fortune, an efficient solution, expecting gratitude. Instead, her unwavering gaze stripped away his composure. "My honor is not for sale," she had said, her voice clear. He had dismissed it as desperate pride, a foolish girl's clinging to an old notion. But the memory clung to him like wood smoke, subtle yet persistent. He stopped by the tall window, looking at his manicured gardens. Everything here was controlled, bought. The air at Thorncastle felt heavy with wealth, unlike Vance Manor. He had built his life on certainty, on transactions. This approach had secured his power. Yet, Eleanor's refusal left a bitter taste. He ran a hand over his polished oak desk. Documents lay stacked, symbols of his calculated dominance. Now they seemed to mock him. He had always believed everything had a price. That money solved all problems. Eleanor shattered that conviction with two short sentences. His dismissive behavior towards her reflected his life's approach. People were chess pieces, relationships were alliances, emotions were weaknesses. He saw Eleanor as a minor inconvenience, easily placated to remove her from his path. He had not considered her a person with inner strength, with a principle beyond gold. A profound discomfort settled within him. He prided himself on reading people, on predicting motives. Yet, he had been spectacularly wrong about Lady Eleanor Vance. He reduced her to a stereotype, a fragile noblewoman needing rescue. The irony was sharp. He, the Duke, had been outmaneuvered not by cunning, but by simple, unyielding integrity. He recalled his youth, his father's words about duty and legacy, vague lessons about a man's word, an unblemished name. But the world he inherited demanded ruthless competition. Such ideals seemed impractical, even naive. He chose pragmatism, a cold logic prioritizing gain above all else. He thought himself smarter. Now, in his opulent study, the silence amplified a hollowness he had long ignored. His life was filled with possessions, with power. But what did it truly hold? His interactions were formal, his conversations guarded, his relationships transactional. He had companions, but no confidants. He had admirers, but no true allies of the heart. Eleanor's defiance rejected not just his money, but his entire worldview. She had shown him his currency was worthless in the face of true honor. This realization felt like a cold hand squeezing his chest. It made him question the very foundation of his existence. Was his outwardly perfect world merely a gilded cage? He remembered his steward, Thomas, once remarking, "The Duke lived a life of breadth but little depth." Alaric had dismissed it as old man's musings. Now the words returned with chilling accuracy. He had accumulated much, but had he truly lived? Had he ever felt the fierce conviction that shone in Eleanor's eyes? His gaze drifted to a portrait of an ancestor, a knight in armor. The knight's eyes held fierce pride, a purpose beyond material gain. He fought for ideals, for his house's honor. Values Alaric saw as antiquated, but seeing Eleanor in his mind, he wondered if those old values held a truth he had carelessly discarded. He prided himself on control, on manipulating situations. With Eleanor, he felt something new, powerlessness against her spirit. Her poverty had not diminished her. His wealth had not corrupted her. She possessed an inner strength transcending social standing, a quiet dignity his fortune could not touch. The emptiness of his transactional relationships became stark. He offered Eleanor money, a cold exchange. He treated her like a business deal. She demanded respect, recognition of her worth, something not quantifiable in pounds. He dismissed her, but she dismissed his approach to human connection. A strange yearning stirred within him, a feeling he could not name. Not desire, but a deeper ache for authenticity, for the unbought truth Eleanor embodied. He had spent his life acquiring, dominating. He never considered what he might be missing, what he forfeited in his relentless pursuit of power. He walked to the window again, the cold panes reflecting his troubled expression. His sharp features, usually composed, now held bewilderment. He had always been so certain of his judgments, his path. Eleanor introduced profound uncertainty, cracking his self-assurance. He considered their contrasting lives. His, of endless resources, driven by calculated advantage. Hers, of scarcity, facing ruin, yet lived with unwavering principle. She had nothing, yet possessed something his wealth lacked. He replayed her words, not just "my honor is not for sale," but the quiet conviction behind them. It was not a plea, but a statement of absolute truth. She sought only to preserve her dignity. In that, she gained something far more profound, his unwilling, undeniable respect. He had dismissed honor as a relic, but seeing it manifest in Eleanor, stripped of advantage, he saw it as a powerful, unyielding force. It was a shield, a beacon. It gave her quiet authority his ducal title could not bestow, an inner regality overshadowing his grandeur. The usual rhythms of his days felt wrong. Servants' clatter, rustling paperwork, stable sounds, all seemed muted. His thoughts kept returning to Vance Manor, not to its decay, but to the woman who resided there, the woman who dared to stand against him. He pictured her tending the neglected rosebush, hands soiled, face etched with sorrow, yet possessed of an unbreakable spirit. He felt a deep, unfamiliar pang of regret, not for the money, but for the callousness of his offer. He sought to buy her silence, her dismissal, his own freedom. He failed to see the woman, the soul, the depth of her character. His life had been transactions, calculated risks. But love, connection, genuine respect were not commodities. They could not be bought. Eleanor taught him that, not with accusations, but with dignified refusal. The lesson was painful, challenging every assumption he held dear. He felt a sudden urge to understand her, the source of her resolve. He wanted to know what sustained her. His own splendid life felt hollow, devoid of such an internal anchor. The air in his study grew heavy with his thoughts. He ran a hand over his face. Sleep had not come easily. He was used to clarity, to decisive action. Now a confusing mix of admiration and regret swirled within him. A nameless longing stirred in his guarded heart. A rare warmth touched Eleanor's face, a soft caress from the afternoon sun as she navigated the lively village fair. The usual quiet of Vance Manor had pressed down upon her, a silence heavy with unspoken worries, until the notion of this small excursion offered a fleeting escape. She clutched a simple straw basket, its lightness a stark contrast to the burden she carried in her heart. Around her, a kaleidoscope of sights and sounds unfolded. Brightly colored ribbons fluttered from makeshift stalls, their hues a cheerful defiance against the muted tones of her own life. The air thrummed with a joyful din, a symphony of hawkers' calls and children's laughter, of fiddles scraping out lively tunes and the distant whir of a small carousel. Eleanor allowed herself a small, secret smile as a gust of wind carried the irresistible scent of roasting nuts in warm, sugary pastries past her. For a moment, the weight of her family's impending ruin, the memory of the Duke's cold offer, all receded. She was simply a young woman, blending into the crowd, observing the simple pleasures of everyday life. Her emerald eyes, usually shadowed with a quiet sorrow, brightened as she watched a puppeteer coax laughter from a small group of wide-eyed children. She felt a delicate tremor pass through her, a fragile hope that perhaps one day such uncomplicated joy might return to her own existence. The jostle of the crowd was a tangible presence, a constant pressure against her side as she moved slowly through the narrow lanes between the stalls. She felt a brief, almost imperceptible warmth against her hand, then a chill, and her fingers locked around the handle of her basket. A sudden, inexplicable stillness descended upon her, silencing the fair's vibrant clamor in her mind. It was as if every sound had faded, every movement frozen, leaving only a sharp, singular awareness. Her gaze, drawn by an unseen force, lifted. Across the swirling sea of faces, amidst the vibrant chaos of the fair, she saw him, Duke Alaric Thorne. He stood taller than most, his dark, impeccably tailored coat a stark, almost regal silhouette against the rustic backdrop. His presence commanded attention, a silent force carving out a space for itself even in the most democratic of settings. His eyes, those piercing blue depths she remembered so vividly from their last encounter, were fixed on her, the breath caught in Eleanor's throat, a sudden painful constriction in her chest. Her heart, which had been beating a steady rhythm against her ribs, now surged with a frantic, wild abandon. It pounded against her breastbone, each throb a loud, insistent drum in her ears, drowning out the fair's cheerful sounds. The world around them seemed to melt away, leaving only their two figures, separated by a shifting veil of people, yet bound by an invisible, powerful thread. She felt a flush creep up her neck, a hot blush staining her cheeks, betraying the sudden intensity of her emotions. His gaze was different now. It was no longer dismissive, no longer coldly appraising, and certainly not indifferent. There was an unfamiliar depth to it, a searching quality that seemed to strip away her defenses, laying bare the vulnerabilities she tried so desperately to conceal. She saw a flicker of something she could only interpret as recognition, perhaps even a profound understanding, in the depths of his eyes. Alaric, for his part, remained perfectly still, a silent sentinel in the bustling marketplace. He watched her, and Eleanor felt the full weight of his attention, an almost physical pressure against her skin. It was a gaze that promised nothing and yet offered everything, a silent question hanging in the sun-drenched air between them. Her mind raced, a torrent of conflicting thoughts and feelings. The memory of his money, his desire to buy her off, still stung with a bitter ache. Yet the way he looked at her now held a strange magnetic pull she could not deny. His lips, usually set in a firm, almost stern line, softened almost imperceptibly at the corners. It was not a smile, not exactly, but a subtle shift that hinted at a different man beneath the Duke's formidable exterior. Eleanor felt a tremor pass through her, a sensation akin to an electric current sparking between them. The unspoken emotions were a tangible force, a heavy cloak draped over their silent exchange. She wanted to look away, to break the spell, to pretend she had not seen him, had not felt the sudden alarming surge of connection. But her eyes remained locked with his, held captive by a force she neither understood nor possessed the strength to resist. There was regret in his gaze, she thought, a fleeting shadow that passed over his aristocratic features. But there was also something else, something new and unsettlingly potent. It was an admiration that spoke volumes without a single word, a silent acknowledgement of her defiance, of her unyielding spirit. Her honor, the very thing she had refused to sell, now seemed to shine back at her from his eyes, reflected and perhaps even revered. A sudden lurch in the crowd pushed a young boy between them, briefly obscuring her view of the Duke. The spell, however momentarily, was broken. Eleanor gasped, a small, involuntary sound that went unheard amidst the fair's renewed clamor. The brief interruption allowed her to tear her gaze away, her heart still hammering wildly against her ribs. Shame mingled with a strange, exhilarating confusion. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the depths of her soul had been laid bare under his intense scrutiny. She could not remain, could not risk another such encounter. The intensity of it all was too much, too overwhelming. Her fingers tightened around her basket, her knuckles white. Without a second thought, she turned abruptly, her movements swift and almost frantic. She pushed through the throng of people, her vision blurred, her ears ringing with the frantic pulse of her own blood. She had to escape, to put distance between herself and that unsettling, profound gaze. Each hurried step was an attempt to outrun the emotion that had flared so unexpectedly between them. Eleanor did not look back, not even once. She fled the fairgrounds, the joyful sounds now a painful cacophony in her retreat, a stark reminder of the fragile peace she had shattered. She did not know what that exchange meant, what it portended for her future, but she knew with a certainty that chilled and thrilled her, that nothing between them could ever be the same. Alaric Thorne watched her go, his piercing blue eyes tracking her hurried departure until she disappeared into the fading afternoon light. A subtle, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a stark contrast to the cold indifference he usually wore. He hadn't expected to see her here amidst the common folk, and her presence had struck him with an unexpected force. Her quiet dignity, even in her simple dress, shone brighter than any jewel. He felt a fierce determination settle deep within him, a resolve that hardened his jaw. He knew now with absolute clarity that he must speak to her again. But this time it would not be about money. Dawn light filled Alaric Thorne's study. He stood by the window, his gaze on Vance Manor, seeing Eleanor's defiance, her quiet dignity. Her retreat from the fair left an ache, a new feeling for him. He knew he had to speak with her again, but not about money. His crude offer now tasted sour. He turned from the window. Silence filled the room, broken only by embers. He walked to his desk, hand over polished mahogany. Legal documents lay there, proof of his calculated power. He pushed them aside. This was not a transaction. This was different, requiring a vulnerability he seldom showed. Her refusal echoed, "My honor is not for sale." Those words shattered his arrogance, revealing a hollowness. He prided himself on shrewdness, seeing the world in gain and loss. Eleanor showed him value beyond currency. She risked everything for an ideal, earning his bewildered respect. His error was seeing her as an object, a strategic component. She refused to be contained. He pulled cream parchment from a drawer, selected a quill, dipped it in ink. His letters were usually dictated, formal. This one would be his own hand, his own thoughts, clumsy or not. His brow furrowed. How could he apologize to a woman he had offended, yet who captivated his mind? He wanted to convey his change, the admiration born from their encounters. He wrote a line, found it stiff. He crumpled the paper, tossed it. A formal address felt like retreating into his old self. He needed to be direct, honest, a man seeking to understand his mistake. He picked up fresh parchment. Closing his eyes, he saw her defiant eyes, heard her courageous voice. "Lady Eleanor," he wrote, words flowing, "I write to you not from expectation, but earnest request." It felt right, lacking his usual coldness. He continued, words chosen with care. He spoke of the fair, not a chance meeting, but a moment solidifying his resolve. He admitted the error of his proposal, regretted the disrespect. Money was unsaid, but his mistake hung in the air. He sought not negotiation, but genuine conversation. He wanted her perspective, free from expectations or burdens. He wanted to offer the respect she deserved. Then, location. Thorne Castle felt a fortress, a symbol of his power. He sought to neutralize it. "I understand my position can be overwhelming," he penned. "I suggest a neutral setting, the gazebo or the library parlor." He wanted her to feel safe, to choose, to know the meeting was for her. He signed simply, Alaric, a small but significant gesture. He sealed it with plain wax, no crest. He summoned Thomas, his trusted footman. "Thomas," Alaric said softly, this note is for Lady Eleanor Vance. Deliver it to her hand alone. No immediate reply, but ensure she receives it safely." Thomas nodded, took the letter carefully. Alaric watched Thomas leave, a knot in his stomach. He had laid bare a hidden part of himself. He had taken a risk greater than financial speculation. His cold indifference cracked, revealing regret, unexpected hope. He did not know Eleanor's response, but he knew he could not go back. Her defiance had altered his course. At Vance Manor, morning began with the quiet hum of struggling nobility. Eleanor sat by the window mending. Lavender and old linen filled the air. Her father rested, his health delicate. The burden felt heavy. Memories of the fair, Alaric's gaze still swirled. That intense exchange left her unsettled, a tremor in her heart. She had retreated to routine, but his eyes remained. A knock interrupted her. Sarah, a servant, appeared at the parlor door. "Lady Eleanor," Sarah whispered, "a messenger from Thorne Castle." Eleanor's needle stilled. Tension seized her. A duke's messenger? Her mind raced, none of the possibilities pleasant. Had he renewed his offer? Indignation flared, then dread for her family. Thomas, the duke's footman, stood quietly in the entryway holding a letter. His posture was respectful. Eleanor rose slowly, heart quickening. She walked toward him, graceful despite an internal tremor. Thomas offered the letter with a bow. "From His Grace, for your eyes only." His voice was low, not stiff. Eleanor took the letter, fingers brushing the parchment. It felt substantial, yet unthreatening. No grand crest, just a simple wax impression. The lack of pomp disarmed her. She thanked Thomas, who nodded, remaining by the door. She returned to her seat. Morning light illuminated the elegant script. Her name, in a bold, distinctive hand, was Alaric's. She broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the lines. Lady Eleanor, I write to you not from expectation, but earnest request. The words were unexpected. No demands. She read on, breath-catching. His admission of error, his regret, his desire for conversation. Not negotiation. The suggestion of the gazebo or library parlor struck her. He acknowledged the power imbalance, attempting to bridge it. A strange warmth spread through her chest, chasing apprehension. It was comforting and terrifying. Her hands, trembling with anxiety, now trembled with something else. Could he be different? Had her defiance reached him? The thought was overwhelming. She reread the note, searching for arrogance. There was none. Only sincerity, a humility that shocked her. A hesitant flutter began in her chest, light and unexpected. It was a dangerous hope, a fragile bloom in her despair. She had trained herself to be guarded, to expect disappointment. This note bypassed her defenses, stirring a buried longing. The possibility of something real, built on respect, flickered. Her emerald eyes, usually shadowed, held a spark of fragile light. She looked out the window, past Vance Manor Gardens. For the first time, she saw not ruin, but a shimmering horizon. The Duke's estate held a silence Eleanor never knew. Not the castle's cold quiet, but a stillness of rustling leaves and sweet roses. Sunlight danced on the mossy path. She had imagined this walk countless times since his note. Each step felt heavy and light. Her heart hammered, a frantic bird in a cage. She clutched the Vance locket, its coolness an anchor. What dangerous hope had his words awakened? She could not say. The secluded gazebo, hidden by ancient oaks, came into view. Duke Alaric Thorne stood with his back to her, watching distant fields. He wore plain dark wool, his posture less rigid. He heard her footsteps before she appeared. His usually steady heart quickened. He had practiced these words countless times, yet now they felt clumsy. This conversation would decide everything. Cold dread settled, more unsettling than any negotiation. The Duke, master of fortunes, felt utterly vulnerable before a woman he had once dismissed. He turned slowly, deliberately. His blue eyes met her emerald ones. The cold indifference and arrogance she remembered were gone. Instead, weariness, a hesitant quality, settled in his gaze. He saw her old defiance, but also a deep weariness that echoed his honesty. Shame for the pain he caused showed. He offered a slight bow, his gaze holding hers, stealing her breath. A strange warmth spread through Eleanor, pushing back apprehension. She stepped into the gazebo. The air thickened with unspoken feelings. The silence stretched, profound with their shared history. A crimson rose petal drifted onto the stone bench. Alaric gestured to the bench. His voice, softer than she had ever heard, stripped of authority. Lady Eleanor, he whispered, thank you for coming. He paused, looking at his clasped hands. Eleanor watched, mesmerized by his unexpected vulnerability. She had prepared for confrontation, but this quiet man was a stranger. She gripped her locket tighter, knuckles white. Was this a new tactic? Her mind urged caution, but a part of her, starved for kindness, yearned to believe. Lady Eleanor, he repeated, voice stronger, laced with regret. I owe you a profound apology. My actions, words, my entire approach were unforgivable. I treated you as an object, a transaction, dismissed with money. I saw only our arrangement, not the woman within it. I saw only my family's problems and the solution you represented. I judged you by my world's conventions, of ledgers and alliances, not human worth. That was my grave error. He met her eyes, his blue gaze earnest, steady, unwavering. Its honesty pressed on her, demanding full attention. I believed then that money was the ultimate value, he continued, his voice trembling. I offered you freedom, but tried to buy your silence, your acquiescence, your honor. I realize now the depth of that insult. Honor like yours cannot be bought. It must be earned and respected. I failed to do either. Eleanor felt a tremor. His words were a balm to her secret wounds. The humiliation, devaluing, and commodity feeling, he understood it all. He acknowledged her pain as no one else had. A single tear tracked down her cheek. This raw honesty was an unexpected gift. The cold knot in her stomach, present since his first offer, began to loosen. Alaric's gaze softened at her tear, a flicker of tenderness. Regret washed over him, seeing her dignity, her hurt. Your unwavering stance, Lady Eleanor, your refusal to be swayed by my arrogant offer, awakened something dormant in me. You stood firm, even facing ruin. You chose integrity over comfort, self-respect over security. That is a rare quality. I admire it more than any fortunes or title. He paused, taking a slow breath. The gazebo hummed. Eleanor heard distant leaves, a bird's chirp, everything else a blur. Her breath hitched. She had expected contempt, not this overwhelming respect. Her mind struggled to reconcile the arrogant Duke with this contrite man. Could this transformation be real? Her heart, despite caution, whispered yes. Therefore, Alaric continued, clear and resolute, I formally withdraw the monetary offer to you and your family. It was born of ignorance and arrogance, having no place between us. Your family's debts are a matter I wish to discuss, not as payment for your hand, nor a balm for my conscience, but as genuine concern, if you permit me. Eleanor stared, her heart a mix of relief and unfamiliar emotion. The months-long pressure, the burden of ruin, lifted for a moment. He looked at her, truly, without judgment or calculation, with sheer honesty in his blue eyes. He saw her as Eleanor, a woman with inner strength he now honored. A warmth spread through her, chasing despair. The locket pressed against her chest, a silent testament to the family honor he praised. Alaric stepped closer. He reached out, his hand hovering, then gently took hers. His touch was warm and steady, his thumb brushing her knuckles. A jolt, like fire, shot through her arm. She did not pull away. The simple contact sent a tremor. His intense gaze held hers captive. He felt the delicate tremor in her hand, her soft skin. The vulnerability he had guarded for years dissolved, leaving him exposed, yet liberated. He had never felt so truly himself. Lady Eleanor, he said low and earnest, I have spent weeks reflecting on my life, its empty pursuits. You, with quiet strength and integrity, showed me a different path. You showed me true honor. I no longer wish for transactions. I want something real, genuine. I want to build something based on respect, understanding, honest connection. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes searching hers, brimming with startling vulnerability. The courage it took for the formidable Duke to bare his soul was not lost on Eleanor. A profound tenderness stirred within her, a feeling she thought lost forever. The air crackled with fragile, powerful energy. The scent of roses mingled with his clean scent. So tell me, Lady Eleanor, he whispered, laden with fragile hope, what is it that you truly desire? Eleanor's breath caught. Tears blurred her emerald eyes. She saw worry lines around his eyes, the slight tremble in his hand. She saw Alaric, not the arrogant Duke, but a humbled, transformed man reaching for connection. Her emotional armor, family struggles, past humiliations dissolved. A relief washed over her, followed by suppressed warmth and tenderness. She felt truly seen, heard, valued. The fragile hope from his note unfurled, radiating through her. A lightness, a sense of possibility, filled her. She thought of her father, the manor, the locket. The bleak future now held a flicker of light, a path of genuine promise. A tentative smile grew on her lips. Tears flowed freely, not from sorrow, but from relief, gratitude, and a dawning, terrifying hope. She looked into his earnest blue eyes, shining with tears, and a soft, trembling whisper escaped her lips. What I truly desire, Your Grace, is